She spent more than 2 decades building something most people only dream about, not just wealth, not just a name on the side of a building. A life that looked from every angle like it had been made to last, like it was unbreakable, like it was permanent. Then quietly it ended. In the spring of 2021, Melinda Gates walked away from her marriage, and the world stopped. Not because divorces don't happen, they happen every day in every city in every kind of life. But because this one felt different. These were two people who had stood together at the edge of enormous things. Two people who had pledged publicly and repeatedly to give away nearly everything they had. Two people whose names appeared side by side on foundation documents, on the walls of hospitals, on the hopes of millions of people in countries most of us will never visit. When it fell apart, the questions didn't come slowly, they came all at once. What really happened inside that marriage? What did she know and for how long? What had she been quietly carrying behind those careful, composed smiles? For a long time, she said almost nothing. She moved through the world quietly. She rebuilt quietly. If she grieved, she did it in private, away from the cameras that had followed her for 30 years. But people change, and what they're willing to say changes with them. Now, years later, there is something new in her life, someone new. And the story of who this man is, and what his presence actually says about where Melinda Gates is today, is far more layered and human than any headline has come close to capturing. Because this was never really a story about a new relationship. It is a story about what it truly costs to rebuild yourself when the entire world is still watching. There is a version of Melinda Gates that most people think they know. She is polished. She is calm. She speaks in careful, measured sentences about global health and systemic inequality. She wears simple clothes to summits where trillion-dollar decisions get made. Her smile is warm but guarded, open but controlled. She is, in almost every public sense, a woman who has spent decades managing, very deliberately, how much of herself the world actually gets to see. But behind that version is another one, quieter. More complicated, more human. She was born Melinda Ann French in Dallas, Texas in 1964. She grew up in a Catholic household where hard work wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Her father was an aerospace engineer. Her mother raised 4 children at home. From an early age, Melinda carried something inside her that would shape everything that came after. A deep, almost restless need to do something that actually mattered. Not just something impressive, something real. She studied computer science and economics at Duke University. She was sharp, focused, and driven in the way that people are when they know, even before they can fully explain it, that they are meant for something larger than what's immediately in front of them. After graduating, she went to work at Microsoft. And then, in 1987, at a trade fair in New York City, she met a man named Bill Gates. What followed was not a simple love story. It was a slow, complicated courtship between two people who were, in many ways, very different, and in other ways, uncomfortably similar. Bill was not an easy person to be close to. He was intensely, sometimes relentlessly focused, intellectually driven in ways that could make ordinary conversation feel almost beside the point. He needed someone who could keep pace with the way his mind moved, and Melinda could. She was sharp where he was restless, grounded where he was abstract. Patient in ways that softened some of his harder edges. They married in 1994, and together they built something that went far beyond Microsoft. When they turned their attention toward philanthropy, it was Melinda who pushed the vision further, toward something that didn't just fund solutions, but tried to understand problems from the ground up, from the inside out. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation became, over time, one of the most influential private organizations on Earth. It reshaped global health policy. It directed billions toward education. It influenced the decisions of governments. It changed the lives of people in places that never made the evening news. And through all of it, Melinda stood at the center, not as a ceremonial figure. Not as a spouse lending her name to someone else's mission, but as a full, committed partner in the work, in the vision, and in the belief that the world could genuinely be better than it was. Which makes what happened next not just surprising, but quietly devastating. For most of their marriage, the Gates household projected something increasingly rare among people of extreme wealth and power: a sense of genuine working partnership. They traveled together to remote clinics across sub-Saharan Africa. They sat across from heads of state and spoke with a shared voice. Every year, they wrote open letters reflecting on their foundation's progress, letters that were widely read, widely cited, and for many people who followed their work. Deeply moving in the way that sincere commitment tends to be. In their private life, there were glimpses of something real being held together by real effort. Melinda spoke in interviews about negotiating time with Bill, about insisting on family dinners no matter what was happening in the world, about trying to raise children who understood that the kind of privilege they were born into came with weight, with obligation, with responsibility. But there were signs, if you were paying attention, that not everything beneath the surface was as steady as it looked. In 2019, Melinda published a book called The Moment of Lift. And for the first time, she let people in a little further than she ever had before. She wrote about the early years of her marriage, about feeling invisible in certain rooms, about the slow and sometimes painful process of finding her own voice within a partnership where her husband's name had always occupied more space than hers. She wrote honestly about her Catholic faith and the tensions she felt between the values she was raised with and the realities she encountered in her global health work. She was candid in a way that surprised people, not inflammatory, not accusatory, but honest in the measured way of someone who has been sitting on truths for a very long time and has finally decided they are safe enough to say out loud. The book was celebrated. She was praised for her openness. And then, as always happens, the news cycle moved on. Looking back now, The Moment of Lift reads like something more than a book about women's empowerment. It reads like a woman beginning, carefully and deliberately, to define herself on her own terms, to practice saying who she was without needing someone else's name to do it. 2 years later, the world would finally understand why. On May 3, 2021, Bill and Melinda Gates announced that their marriage was over. The statement was brief. It was formal. It said the decision had been made together after a great deal of careful thought. It said they would continue to work side by side at the foundation. It wished each other well. It was the kind of statement that is written to contain something enormous inside very few words. The world did not take it at face value. Within days, reports began to surface. There were stories about Bill Gates's behavior in workplace settings, about a relationship he allegedly had with a Microsoft employee years earlier, about complaints that had reportedly been raised and investigated at the board level. And then there was the matter of Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier with whom Bill had reportedly met on multiple occasions, well after Epstein's criminal history had become a matter of public record. According to people close to her, the Epstein connection had been deeply troubling to Melinda. Not as a single incident, but as something she could no longer reconcile with the life and the partnership she believed she was part of. Reports indicated she had consulted divorce attorneys as early as 2019, the same year her book came out, which suggested the decision to leave had not come suddenly. It had been arrived at slowly, painfully, through a long private process that no one outside her inner circle could fully see. She had thought about this. She had sat with it for a long time. She had been in some quiet and deeply personal way preparing herself. What followed the announcement was a period Melinda has since described, in careful terms, as one of profound disorientation. She had spent nearly 30 years as one half of something enormous. Her identity, her work, her sense of daily purpose, all of it had been built in relationship to that partnership. And now that it was gone, she had to begin the hard, strange work of figuring out who she was without it. That is not a small thing, for anyone. But for a woman who had been analyzed and photographed and debated for decades, doing that private, necessary work in any kind of real peace was nearly impossible. She retreated where she could. She leaned on her children, her faith, and the small circle of people she genuinely trusted. She began slowly and carefully to build something new, something that would be entirely unambiguously hers. And then gradually she began to be seen again, differently, alone at first. And then, eventually, not alone. When the divorce was finalized in August 2021, Melinda Gates received a settlement reported to be worth several $billions. In 2024, she departed the Gates Foundation entirely, ending the professional partnership that had outlasted the personal one. It was a clean break, a complete one. What she built in the space that followed was entirely her own. She expanded Pivotal Ventures, her investment and incubation company, with a sharpened focus on women's economic independence and social progress. She directed major donations toward organizations working on reproductive rights and healthcare access. She began speaking more plainly and more directly about issues she had previously navigated with more caution, because, for the first time in decades, she no longer had to negotiate her public voice with anyone else. People who sat across from her during this period noticed something different. She seemed lighter somehow, more willing to laugh easily, more willing to say what she actually thought without immediately softening it for the room. She also began traveling differently, not as a representative of a foundation with global obligations, but for herself, to places that held meaning for her personally with people she had genuinely chosen to be around. And it was during this quieter, more deliberate chapter that reports began to emerge about a man named Philip Munger. The name meant little to most people, and that, in itself, was worth pausing on. Philip Munger is not a technology billionaire. He is not a political figure. He does not exist in the dense ecosystem of power, capital, and influence that has surrounded Melinda Gates for most of her adult life. He is a composer, a musician. The son of the late Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's legendary business partner, but someone who in his own life chose art over finance, sound over strategy, creation over accumulation. That difference is not a small detail. Melinda Gates spent nearly 30 years beside one of the most analytically driven minds of the modern era. A man for whom the world was, at its core, a set of problems to be identified and solved. A man who processed information at a speed that could make most human interaction feel inefficient by comparison. Philip Munger inhabits a completely different world. One shaped by music, by emotional depth, by the kind of creative solitude that has nothing to prove and nowhere urgent to be. Whether that contrast was coincidence, or whether it says something deliberate and true about what Melinda needed next, is a question that only she can answer. Philip Munger is, in almost every sense, a private person. He grew up with significant wealth. His father's name is synonymous with long-term thinking and quiet, principled brilliance, but he did not follow Charlie Munger into investing. He chose music instead. He studied composition. He built a life oriented around artistic creation, around the kind of work that resists being measured or optimized or turned into a quarterly result. He has supported arts organizations and been involved in philanthropy in ways that rarely attracted attention. People who know him describe him as thoughtful, genuinely warm, and deeply uninterested in the kind of public visibility that has followed Melinda Gates everywhere she has gone for 30 years. That is, to many who have been watching her story unfold, perhaps the most striking thing of all. There is something almost quietly symbolic about it. A woman who spent decades at the center of a global empire, whose every word was examined and whose every appearance was dissected. Choosing to spend her time with someone who has spent his own life contentedly, deliberately outside all of that. According to reports, the two were first publicly linked in 2024. The details of how they came to know each other have not been shared. But people close to Melinda have described her, in this chapter of her life, as genuinely happy. Not the curated, careful version of happiness that public figures sometimes project as a form of image management. Something more honest than that. Something that doesn't appear to be performing for anyone. The reaction online was predictably divided. Some people responded with warmth, with something close to relief on her behalf. A feeling that she had earned this, that after the very public unraveling of her marriage, after the scrutiny and the stories and the years of carefully chosen words, she deserved to feel settled and truly seen. Others were skeptical, cynical in the particular way the internet becomes when it encounters something it cannot easily categorize. Questions were raised about timing, about motivation, about what it means for a woman of her position to choose someone so fundamentally different from what came before. But perhaps the most honest question, the one that cuts through all the noise, is the simplest one. Why should it need to be explained at all? There is a particular kind of scrutiny that follows powerful women when they make personal choices. It is different from what men face, not always loudly different. Not always in ways that are easy to point to directly, but structurally different in the way that certain expectations get attached to certain lives. When a woman who has been long defined by her relationship to a powerful man steps into her own story, fully. Without that relationship as context, the world tends to treat that step as something that requires decoding. Something that needs a reason, a justification, an explanation that satisfies the public's sense of what the story should be. Melinda Gates has been living inside that kind of scrutiny for years now. And what is perhaps most remarkable about this chapter of her life is how little she has felt the need to perform it for anyone else's benefit. She has not sat down for a splashy, revealing magazine interview about Philip Munger. She has not made her new relationship the centerpiece of a carefully timed media strategy. She has not opened her home to cameras to demonstrate that she is healed, that she is whole, that she has come out the other side of everything looking exactly as composed as she always has. She has simply been living, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but in the way that real people live imperfectly privately one ordinary day at a time. Her work through pivotal ventures continues to grow and deepen. Her philanthropic focus has become more personal and more direct since her departure from the Gates Foundation, with particular attention to organizations that support women navigating major life transitions. That focus, given everything she has lived through in recent years, does not feel incidental. It feels like something drawn from genuine experience. She has spoken in various contexts about reinvention, about the real difficulty of releasing an identity you spent decades building, about the strange, disorienting freedom that arrives when something you believed was permanent reveals itself not to be. These are not polished talking points. They are the words of someone who has genuinely sat with loss, and who has come out the other side holding something that looks, carefully and honestly considered, like clarity. Philip Munger is part of that story. What part exactly remains appropriately private? Relationships that exist largely outside the public eye resist the kind of tidy narration the internet tends to demand. But the broad shape of something is visible, even if the details remain her own. A woman who was, for a very long time, one half of something built on logic and scale and global mission has found her way toward something quieter. Smaller in scope, perhaps, but more fully hers. Whether it lasts, whether it deepens, whether it eventually becomes a story told in full, none of that can be said with any certainty today. What can be said is that she seems, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, to be writing something entirely of her own. There is something that consistently gets lost in the coverage of people like Melinda Gates, behind the foundation, behind the billion-dollar settlement. Behind the headlines and the speculation and the carefully worded public statements, there is a person. A woman in her 60s who has lived an extraordinary life, and who is now doing the same thing that every human being eventually has to do. Regardless of their wealth or influence or the size of their name, figuring out what comes next. The world finds that hard to simply allow. There is always the urge to analyze, to assign meaning. To take someone's private, unfolding journey and shape it into a narrative that satisfies from the outside. And Melinda Gates, by virtue of everything she represents, will never be fully free from that. But watching this chapter from a respectful distance, something feels true in a way that is hard to dismiss. She is not running from anything. She is not performing recovery. She is not staging the kind of comeback that public figures sometimes engineer, complete with carefully timed revelations and a clean, redemptive arc designed to reassure the audience that everything is fine now. She is simply living, imperfectly, purposefully, on terms she has chosen for herself. And Philip Munger, whoever he is to her, in whatever way he genuinely matters, exists within that life as something the world rarely extends to powerful women: real privacy. A connection that hasn't been fully explained or justified or packaged for public consumption. There is quiet dignity in that. It is easy to forget, in the endless current of information that surrounds people at this level of public life, that not everything is owed to the audience. That some chapters are not written for anyone else to read. That some choices don't need a press release, or a soundbite, or a moment where someone sits across from a journalist and explains themselves into legibility. The most profoundly human moments in any life, the grief, the tenderness, the slow and uncertain process of learning to trust something again, tend to live in the quiet. In the spaces between the things that get reported, Melinda Gates has spent most of her life in the light. She has been photographed and praised and criticized and speculated about. She has carried enormous work and very real loss with a composure that has, at times, appeared almost impossible to sustain. Maybe this is what after finally looks like when it arrives. Not a dramatic reinvention, not a triumphant return to the world stage, just a woman living her life at a scale that is at last completely, entirely her own. That might be the most unexpected truth of all. If something in this story stayed with you, something about starting over, about finding yourself again after loss, about the quiet courage it takes to live your own life when the world is still deciding what it thinks of you, share it in the comments. These stories deserve more than a headline. They deserve to be sat with. If this kind of careful, human storytelling is what you come here for, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another story worth telling the right way.